The God Project by Oz Thomas. Chapter 1. In all of his years studying chemistry, genetics, biology, and physics, he had thought it was impossible. But there it was. There she was. On the cold aluminum desk in front of him was a real live baby girl that he had created. He did not create her from a test tube of unstable chemicals in an artificially mimicked mothering environment, nor as a clone of someone long dead and hence containing unstable DNA. No. Max had watched and guided the chemicals. He added heat so that they could bond and form proteins. He set them loose in a gravity-free chamber and allowed them to pursue their own destiny. The chemicals learned over time and from the life around it, especially from the DNA of him and his long-dead wife. It understood what life meant better than he ever would. He didn't provoke or shock it into submission like he had in the past, because that always produced results that were missing something. The first time he created artificial life, it couldn't support itself. It required constant monitoring and eventually it lost the will to even breathe. The second time, life operated like a computer. It seemed healthy, but it wasn't interested in people, and so it ran away and eventually died. This would be the fifth time, and Max hoped that it would be the charm. Max watched this life grow. As he watched her form, he learned from her as much as she learned from him. And mere months later, the girl was born. He was in awe. He was in love. He didn't know if he should even call her his creation because she had created herself as much as he had helped. She had the wisdom of the universe inside of her, and he was sure she would be no mere homunculus, no mere shadow life like the others that came before her, like all of the other artificially created women he had made. She was real. Life, at its essence, is incomprehensible. It is unknowable, Max scrawled onto a coffee-stained page in his journal. He tried desperately to understand how this life had come to be, but he truly did not understand it. All that he knew was that a female human was alive on the table in front of him, and that had not been seen for the past 5 years. "I did it, Amelie," the frail man half whispered to himself as he looked into the distance, imagining he was talking to someone. He nervously read and reread the notes that were scattered throughout the lab, returning frantically to poke, prod, measure, and understand as much as he could about the life that he had just created. She cried and sputtered, and he nervously avoided her and took notes. "I thought this would make me happy," he muttered to himself. "I've made one of the biggest scientific breakthroughs of the past 100 years, but instead of happy, I just feel nervous. Nervous about what this will mean if we actually have a real human female once again. You're the most dangerous and important person in the world right now," he told the babe, staring into her bright blue eyes. He fumbled for some cigarettes in his pocket. "No," he said. "I can't worry about her. I fulfilled my contract, done my job, and now my bills are paid." He looked at a picture on his desk. The one lone picture amidst a mess of scientific equipment, coffee, and snacks. It was a picture of Max and a woman with bright blue eyes. As he looked at the faded picture, he whispered, "Amelie, I wish you were here." As if on cue, the baby began crying. He looked at her nervously. "I might be able to keep you for a few weeks, hold off the dream detectives by using logic and argumentation, but pretty soon the lawyers and brain bleachers will come. You'll be taken, brought up in a strict environment where your entire life, even your recreational activities, will be predetermined. You would have everything, and you'd be pushed to your absolute peak to become the mother of a new generation. How could I do better than that?" She wouldn't stop crying. Max looked nervously at the photo. "But that's not what you want, is it?" He stared at the baby. The eyes stared back at him. Then he looked back at the photo. "You're not going to let me give her over to the government, are you?" Max sighed, then brushed aside candy bar wrappers, empty coffee cups, and fast food containers and began to write in his notebook. I thought this would be just another job. I would simply use my knowledge of biology, chemistry, and genetics to create a woman and end our population problem. But it wasn't that easy. Life wouldn't just do what I wanted. If life were to be created, it seemed it would have to be on its own terms. It wasn't until I started to listen and follow my intuition that I began to understand why I had failed and what I needed to do to succeed. He trembled and hesitated again. He didn't know what to write or maybe if he should write. I wish I could explain exactly how this life came to be, but life had seemed to work out on its own. I gave it an environment to grow in and it chose to grow. I think we should follow life's example and trust that it knows what is best for itself and it knows what it needs. He finished the page, forcing a smile. The baby paused and looked up at him. Max stood distant, almost paralyzed. I wonder what it wants, he said, half to himself. Then, realizing the living being that he was responsible for lying before him, he nervously reached out an arm and patted her head. There, he said awkwardly. Are you hungry, tired, or thirsty, or perhaps just curious? It didn't answer. She didn't answer. The baby looked at him quizzically, pausing for a second and then resumed bawling. You would have loved her, Amelie. She even has your eyes, the man said, and then, leaning closely, he picked her up and nervously brought her close to him. She burped, then sighed, stopped crying, and quickly fell into a light sleep as he rocked her back and forth quietly. So, that's what you needed, Amelie, he said, and then smiled because the name fit so perfectly. While holding the baby, he reached for his notebook. As if noticing his lapse of attention, Amelie began crying and he quickly dropped the notebook and began slowly rocking and humming to her again. He sighed as he held her, unable to move, trapped. When Amelie fell asleep, he placed her in an antique wooden crib that seemed woefully out of place in the cold, practical, sterile lab. Max then opened the slick metal door that led to a balcony and lit a cigarette. He breathed in the cold, dry air and looked over the neon lights of the megacity before him. He could see helicopters, airplanes, and traffic, all from a distance in the bustling metropolis. He could hear sirens and alarms, music and fighting. He could see advertisements in the sky and neon signs in the fields. He could see apartment buildings that house millions and suburban developments that looked like ant colonies from afar. As he admired all of this from afar, breathing in the smell of asphalt and sulfur and carbon pollution along with the cigarette smoke, he crouched over, lost in thought. He breathed out the smoke and at last he relaxed his tense shoulders. He looked back at his angel asleep in the crib. He was lost in thought. The scientist then looked over the dreamlike city and finished his cigarette, then hurried back inside. Amelie looked content. It was 10 at night. He sat down in his chair and reviewed his notes. He looked nervous and yet right at home with his work. As he sat, eyes locked on his notes, his hands pouring a cup of coffee, his phone vibrated. He jumped and looked at the caller ID. He hesitated when he saw the number, swallowed apprehensively, and after a brief pause, he answered the phone. Hello, the young scientist said, trying to sound confident. An extremely masculine, deep, and powerful voice responded at the other end. Hello, Max. I'm glad you called. Max hesitated, his mind half in his notebooks and half worried about his daughter. I meant to call, Lieutenant Andre. I'm always glad to hear from you, he said. Dispense with the pleasantries, scientist. You know I'm a military man, and if there's one thing I can't stand, it's when people don't get to the point. I've just gotten word that a new female synthoid has been created in your lab, Andre said matter-of-factly. How did you know? Max asked. How did I not know? Remember that you're being monitored, Maximilian. Your work is too important to our national security for us not to. Don't you think? I guess so, Max said. I guess so, Andre parroted. Your breakthrough hasn't boosted your confidence 1 centimeter. You've made the scientific leap of the decade, an advancement that will save our country from implosion. It's going to help us repopulate and get back on top where we belong. Well, it is my job, Max said. Yes, Andre said. And we will meet soon enough, but for now I insist you celebrate. I'm going to send you some friends to help you party. Please don't, Max insisted. I wouldn't want to disturb the child. You are so boring, Andre said. Do you ever do anything besides work? I'm half machine, and even I'm not as obsessed with work as you are. Maybe you're right, Max said, but I'm going to insist you don't send anyone, as it may upset Amelie. Amelie, Andre repeated. You do know naming is a big no-no, but it's not unexpected coming from you. You never did seem to understand the importance of remaining detached from your work. Despite being one of the most brilliant minds I've ever met, you're also terribly naive and foolish. But it doesn't matter. Go ahead and call her a name if you want. I'll still see you soon enough. Max said nothing in response. Listen, Max, I'm not judging you. I just don't want you to get attached. You don't understand how tough this world is, what it takes to survive. I don't think you really understand who this woman is going to be. I guess you're right, Max said. I know I'm right, Andre said. Now do something to celebrate. This is the Life Project, and you've just become a god. Let me remind you again, you've created real, stable life. Just sit back and bask in your glory. Enjoy the fruits of your labor. Perhaps set yourself up to get some biological enhancements. When Max didn't say anything in response, Andre continued. I give up, Andre said. Just promise me to keep me in the loop after you run your tests or whatever it is that you say you have to do. Of course, Max said, smiling. Should I send my latest notes and results via email to you detectives at the research and science departments down at HQ? That would be good, Andre said, then hung up. Max nervously looked back at the babe in the crib, then he turned the phone off so that he wasn't disturbed and walked up to Amelie, who was quietly sleeping in her crib. He hooked the baby up to a machine to check her heart rate. A long wire checked her lungs, and a quick scan qMRI checked her internal systems. She was perfectly healthy. He walked outside, lit a cigarette, and watched the city. He thought about the babies he had created before Amelie again. The one that Andre had pumped full of sedatives when it began to panic. The one that was disposed of when it turned into a boy. Amelie would be the 5th one, and the first that had been made since his wife's passing. I wish you were here, Max whispered to himself, thinking of his late wife. I wish you were here to help me, he said, before going back inside. Amelie was crying again, but she quickly quieted when Max picked her up. Max readied a bottle of synthetic formula, the best he could do at the time being. It had all the right vitamins and minerals, and many would say it was more chemically pure than the real breast milk, but Max looked at it with suspicion. He sat down with her, giving her the bottle, and within minutes she fell asleep in a chair, and he along with her. He felt like they were the only people in the world